In the world of the waking dead, survival isn't a gift. It's an endless, grueling curse. The earth is a foul graveyard, where the dead walk and the living cling to fractured memories of a world that no longer exists. But in one hospital room in King County, Georgia, a man lies deathly still, untouched by the ruin outside. Machines beep steadily in rhythm with his pulse, oblivious to the skeletal moans and snarls of a world gone feral. That man is Rick Grimes, and in this version of the story, he never wakes up. The hospital stands in muted decay, long since raided by scavengers and abandoned by the living. Time has forgotten about Rick except for Shane Walsh. For months after the world unraveled, Shane returned, sometimes to check on his friend, other times to sit silently in the sterile gloom and confess his fears to a man who couldn't answer. But on the day Shane gave in to grief, truly believing Rick wasn't coming back, he made a choice that rippled far beyond himself. He stayed with Lori and Carl. They left the doomed hospital behind, leaving Rick to his cadaverous silence. The Grimes family never reached the quarry camp outside Atlanta. They never joined the scrappy band of survivors led by Rick's shaky but ultimately dependable moral compass. Instead, they joined a different group, a ragtag bunch less concerned with community and survival, and more with power and control. Shane, hardened by guilt and his desire to protect Lori and Carl, fit in well with this new group, even as it caused fractures between him and Lori. Carl, young and impressionable, saw this as the way the world worked now. It was Shane, not Rick, who became his model for survival. Meanwhile, Rick remained in his coma, untouched by the darkness steadily consuming the world outside. His body was sustained by the last gasps of the hospital's backup generators, miraculously left on for longer than anyone expected. But the inevitable came all the same. One night, as the hospital's power finally flickered its last, the machines hooked to Rick stopped their steady hum, leaving him adrift between life and death. But he didn't die. He didn't become one of them. Whether by luck, chance, or something deeper, Rick's body, wounded but stubborn, clung to existence. Even as he slipped from memory, the world beyond spun on without him. Atlanta fell. The initial screams that blanketed the world gave way to a dull and desperate silence, punctuated by gunfire, snarls, and the occasional ragged cry. Governor Philip Blake emerged in Woodbury, wielding charm and tyranny in equal measure. Negan's rise to power began with the seeds of the Savior's genesis. Humanity fractured further into survival of the fittest factions. Yet somewhere on the fringes of it all, Lori, Carl, and Shane trudged onward with their cold-hearted new companions. Lori grew wearier every day. Her heart tugged between protecting Carl and fearing the man Shane was becoming. Equal parts savior and monster, Carl was no longer the bright-eyed boy Rick had known. Under Shane's guidance, he quickly became a warrior. He learned to wield a knife before his 10th birthday. His first human kill followed not long after. Shane congratulated him for it, a subtle but gutting signal to Lori that her son's innocence was already a casualty of this world. One night, she sat beside Carl and ran a trembling hand through his hair. "You remember your dad?" she asked in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "How he was?" Carl looked up at her. "Dad wouldn't have made it. Not in this world." Lori turned away so her son wouldn't see the tears brimming in her eyes. Across the state, in a decaying farmhouse on the outskirts of nowhere, Herschel Green didn't find a wounded stranger named Rick Grimes. He didn't arm himself with hope that outsiders might one day bring salvation. Instead, his farm remained isolated, a lonely oasis against an increasingly hostile world. Without Rick's leadership to tether the splintering groups of survivors, the events that once set him on the path to Herschel's barn, the road to unity and redemption, never came to pass. Maggie spent months wondering if someone out there could save them, but Herschel dismissed the thought each time. They couldn't risk it. At the quarry, the group of survivors led by Shane didn't hold. Discord festered quickly in Rick's absence. Without someone like Rick to temper tempers and act as the glue for disparate individuals, the camp split apart. T-Dog, Andrea, Dale, and the others scattered into the wilderness. One of them didn't survive the first week on their own. Others fell into groups far worse than the camp they'd left. In this fractured world, the message was clear. You survived alone or with those you could dominate. No one was safe. Daryl Dixon remained with his brother Merle for longer than any timeline should have allowed. Though the deep resentment Daryl held for Merle still simmered, the absence of Rick's influence meant there was no catalyst to break them apart. And so Daryl, destined now to never become the man he might have under Rick's leadership, remained in his brother's shadow, scavenging and surviving by brute force and intimidation rather than by honor. Somewhere, in the dark recesses of his mind, Daryl longed for something he couldn't name. A purpose, perhaps. A cause. But he would never find it this time around. And then there was Rick. Months passed. His body weakened but persisted, like some stubborn fixture in an empty, forgotten place. Eventually, impossibly, his eyelids fluttered open. When Rick woke, the world greeted him with silence. For hours, he didn't move, his muscles atrophied, his mind disoriented. The dried blood caked into his hospital gown spoke of horrors he couldn't yet fathom. Slowly, he sat up, wincing at the sharp pain in his side from the gunshot wound that had put him in this state. He staggered to his feet, leaning heavily on the four-pole for balance. Something about the stillness of the hospital felt wrong. Not peaceful, but foreboding. Death loomed, unseen but felt, in every corner. Rick stumbled through the halls, his heart pounding faster with each step. When he first saw the walkers, his mind rejected the sight. They weren't people. No, they used to be people. What were they now? Monsters? Demons? This world had gone to hell while he had been comatose, and no one had been there to explain the rules to him. Once outside, the full scope of the devastation hit him. Cars abandoned, buildings crumbled like neglected tombstones, corpses strewn about like discarded garbage, and no sign of his family. His voice cracked when he called their names. Lori, Carl, but there was no reply. Rick's journey through this broken world was a lonely one. Without the group to stumble upon, without the community that could ground him, he wandered like a ghost, searching for a whisper of familiarity. Each step stripped another part of him away. The Rick who had worn the badge of a deputy sheriff, the Rick who had believed in law and order gradually faded. He killed to survive walkers, animals, people. His mind frayed at the edges, torn between the guilt of who he had been and the brutality of what he'd become. Each night he dreamed of Carl, of Lori, of safety. Each morning, he woke to a world that defied those dreams. Eventually, whispers of survivors reached him. A stronghold somewhere called Woodbury, a haven under the rule of a man who claimed to have rebuilt society. When Rick crossed paths with the governor, emaciated and half-mad from his time alone, the man at first welcomed him with open arms. But the dynamic shifted quickly when the governor saw Rick's instability, his inability to submit. "You're not a man of this world," the governor told him, his voice equal parts pitying and patronizing. "Men like you don't last." "I've lasted so far," Rick replied. But it was clear to them both that Rick was, in many ways, already dead. And so the world spun on. Lori, broken by her choices, eventually met her end at the hands of the group she and Shane had allied with. Carl, hardened and embittered, grew into something Rick would not have recognized. A remorseless survivor, living by the mantra Shane had drilled into him: trust no one. Somewhere on the outskirts of Savannah, Carl killed his first innocent man, and he didn't flinch when the deed was done. Daryl became more like Merle with each passing day. Maggie grew cold and insular, a shadow of the hopeful young woman she once was. And Rick roamed, an aimless wanderer, searching for something he would never find. In this version of the story, Rick didn't wake up to lead the world towards something better. He woke into a nightmare he couldn't escape. A nightmare where the worst parts of people went unchecked, where hope was an ember everyone stomped out long ago. And as Rick sat one day, alone, staring at the horizon, he wasn't certain if the world had failed him, or if he had failed the world. The days bled into weeks, and Rick Grimes continued his solitary drift through the ashen remnants of Georgia, driven less by purpose than by the primal need to keep moving. But survival in this world demanded more. Sharper reflexes, harder choices, and sacrifices he wasn't yet ready to make. He was no longer just a man recovering from a coma. He was an exposed nerve, raw and fragile, navigating a landscape that punished hesitation. One evening, as the orange glow of sunset draped the husks of the dead trees in golds and reds, Rick stumbled across a small encampment. At first, he approached cautiously, one hand gripping the jagged piece of rebar he had scavenged as a weapon. The voices drifting toward him were subdued, tired, but human. That fragile sound was enough to pull him in despite his better judgment. He crept closer, his stomach knotting with both hope and fear. The camp turned out to be a trap. The moment he stepped into what looked like a poorly constructed safe zone, the stark click of a revolver hammer being cocked froze him in his tracks. A man with weather-beaten features emerged from the shadows, flanked by others brandishing weapons cobbled together from scraps. Rick raised his hands, the rebar slipping from his fingers. "You don't look dangerous," the man said, stepping closer and eyeing Rick like he was dissecting him. His voice was deep and gravelly, but there was no warmth in it. "Just lost." Rick didn't protest. Lost was the least of what he felt. They stripped him of his meager belongings and bound his hands, dragging him to their fire. He was made to sit among them, a captive in the very world he once thought he'd protect with a badge and a gun. There was no code here, no procedure to follow. Their leader, a woman named Marla with piercing green eyes and a voice like broken glass, looked him over and issued the verdict. He would earn his place by proving himself useful, or he wouldn't live to see the morning. Rick said nothing, his jaw tight, his mind racing. He couldn't trust them, and he certainly couldn't fight them all. But over the course of the night, as the group shared a meal of canned beans and bitter silences, Rick began to see the fractures between them. Subtle but telling glances, whispered conversations just out of earshot. This wasn't a cohesive unit. It was desperation holding itself together with frayed threads. When Marla sent 2 of her men to escort Rick to a makeshift pen to sleep, he seized his chance. With his wrists still bound, he lured one of the men close under the pretense of stumbling, then surged upward, slamming his head into the man's face. Blood splattered as the man howled in pain, and Rick spun toward the second, driving his shoulder into his captor's chest with the full force of his weight. They tumbled to the ground, and Rick used the chaos to free himself, teeth gnashing at the rope until it frayed enough for his hands to break free. Gunshots cracked through the air as Marla and the others scrambled to respond, but Rick didn't give them the chance. He slipped away into the woods, sprinting blindly through the shadows until he couldn't hear their shouts anymore. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, his body trembling with adrenaline, he realized something profound. He was getting better at this, and that terrified him. By the time he reached the edges of what used to be Atlanta, he was a different man than the one who had crawled out of that hospital. He was quieter, colder, and less willing to trust. Yet, no matter how much the world chipped away at Rick Grimes, it couldn't erase the core part of him that believed people, at least some people, could be better. That belief was a flickering light inside him, and though the wind of this new world tried its best to extinguish it, he fought to keep it alive. As he stood at the ruins overlooking the city, his eyes caught movement in the distance. A convoy of vehicles snaked through the broken streets below, the loud growl of engines attracting clusters of walkers. Men and women in scavenged gear leaned out of the windows, picking off the dead with astonishing efficiency. At first, Rick thought they might be the government or what was left of it. But then he saw the flag on the lead vehicle, black with crude white letters scrawled across it. The Reapers rule. The Reapers weren't the largest faction to claim dominance in this part of the South, but they made up for their size with unparalleled ferocity. Rick had heard their name spoken in passing whispers during his travels. Stories of a group that didn't just kill to survive but killed because it was their doctrine. The world had braced them in iron and stripped them of anything human, leaving only predators behind. Rick could have walked away, let the convoy rumble past and continued his lonely path. But within the procession of snarling vehicles, he saw something that froze him in place. A boy, no older than 10, sat in the bed of a pickup, his face a rigid mask of defiance. The boy wasn't screaming or crying, but the bruises on his arms told Rick everything he needed to know. It wasn't until the boy turned his head that Rick's breath caught in his throat. It was Carl. The scar on his cheek, the way his hair curled just like Laurie's. There was no mistaking it. His son was there, entrenched among ruthless killers. Rick felt the world tilt beneath him, the sheer improbability of it leaving him gasping. He wasn't ready for that moment, wasn't ready to find his family in the clutches of people like the Reapers. But ready or not, there they were. Rick trailed the convoy for miles, his heart pounding with every step. Though the Reapers moved quickly, their loud presence drew enough walkers to slow them down, giving Rick the chance to keep pace without being spotted. He didn't know what his plan was. He didn't even know if he'd have the courage to act when the time came. All he knew was that he wasn't going to let Carl slip away again. Night fell before they stopped, setting up camp in the ruins of what appeared to be an old factory compound. Rick watched from the shadows, his hands shaking as he gripped the rebar that had become his constant companion. He saw Carl handed a rifle by a man with a jagged scar running down his bald scalp. The way Carl held it, steady, practiced, sent a pang of sorrow through Rick. His son wasn't a child anymore. There was no room for stealth or careful planning. Rick moved on instinct, slipping between the buildings until he was within yards of the firelight. He spotted Carl sitting near the edge of the group, his eyes distant even as the others laughed and shared stolen bottles of whiskey. Marla's words rang in Rick's ears. "Prove you're useful or don't survive." Carl had proven himself, of that Rick had no doubt. Panic clawed at Rick's chest as every possible scenario raced through his head. If he revealed himself now, they'd kill him outright, or worse, they'd kill Carl just for knowing him. But if he waited too long, if he hesitated, he might lose the only chance he'd have to save his son. Rick didn't wait. He stepped out into the firelight, raising his hands just as he had weeks before with Marla's group. The Reapers reacted instantly, weapons snapping into place, but Rick's eyes never left Carl's. For a heart-stopping moment, father and son held each other's gaze as the world around them seemed to stop. "Carl," Rick said hoarsely, his voice breaking. "It's me. It's Dad." But Carl's face didn't soften. There was no flicker of recognition, no rush of relief. Instead, he stood up, cocked the rifle in his hands, and aimed it directly at Rick's chest. And in that moment, Rick realized the cruelest truth of all. His son was gone. Rick stood frozen, his mind rejecting the sight before him, his chest aching as though the aimed rifle had already fired. Carl, his boy, his son, was pointing a weapon at him, his small frame steady in a way that should have been impossible for a child. The firelight danced across Carl's face, casting shadows that made him look so much older than his years. For a heartbeat, neither father nor son moved. Then Carl spoke. "You're not him," Carl said, his voice flat and cold, stripped of all recognition. "My dad's dead." Rick flinched as the words landed like a blow to his stomach. He opened his mouth to argue, to shout the truth, but the scene around him left no room for sentiment. The Reapers were advancing slowly, their weapons trained on him, their eyes feral and distrustful. Sanctuary wasn't something they offered. Rick's eyes flicked to the other men, then back to Carl. He didn't risk lowering his hands. An older man in a patched leather jacket barked out a short laugh. "Kid, he says he's your daddy?" The man sneered, leveling a shotgun as if this was all some grim joke. "Looks like he's got a death wish." Carl didn't look at the man, didn't look at anyone except Rick. There was something fractured in his gaze, a struggle buried deep beneath the anger. A flicker of doubt. Maybe, but doubt wasn't enough. Not in this world. Rick felt his breath catch in his throat. "Carl," Rick rasped, his voice trembling with desperation. "It's me. I'm your dad. Shut up." Carl's voice cracked as he stepped forward, his fingers tightening on the trigger. Rick wanted to believe it was fear that tinged his son's voice, but the intent in Carl's grip, the hard set of his jaw, left no room for comfort. This wasn't the Carl he remembered, and a part of him began to wonder if that boy even existed anymore. The others were closing in now, emboldened by what they thought was hesitation on Carl's part. A tall woman with jagged scars running down her forearm gestured toward Rick with a blade that glimmered in the firelight. "Kid, just take the shot," she drawled lazily. "End it. End him. Rules are rules, even for ghosts. Don't listen to them," Rick shouted, his voice thunderous, desperate. "Carl, you remember me. You know me. I'm your father. God damn it." But Carl didn't lower the rifle. His lips twisted into a grim approximation of a smile, one that didn't belong on someone so young. "You don't get it?" he growled quietly, almost to himself. "This is how it works now, Dad. You wouldn't understand. You can't." Rick's hands trembled, his mind darting back to the moment Lori had told him about Carl's birth, how she had cried for hours afterward because she hadn't wanted to bring him into such a cruel world. Back then, the world had still had rules. There had been law, order, hope for a future. Now, all of it was gone, burned away like the landscape around them. And what stood before Rick was not his son, but something entirely new, forged in fire and blood. Before Rick could speak again, chaos interrupted the standoff. From the shadows on the edge of the camp, a herd of walkers surged, drawn by the firelight and the shouting. They poured in with grotesque, slack-jawed hunger, their numbers multiplying like storm clouds on the horizon. The Reapers broke formation immediately, shouting orders and scattering into defensive positions. The woman with the scar lunged toward the perimeter, her knife slicing cleanly into the head of an advancing walker. Rick used the moment to edge closer to Carl, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Carl, we have to go," Rick urged, his voice thick with urgency. "Now!" But Carl didn't budge. He stared at the incoming walkers for a long moment before tilting his head back toward Rick with a cold detachment that froze his blood. "If you don't leave now, they'll kill you," Carl said simply. "And they'll make me do it." Rick swallowed hard, searching his son's face for something human beneath the mask of survival. But Carl was already turning, lifting his rifle to pick off the nearest walker with a clean, practiced shot. The recoil didn't faze him. Rick didn't stay to watch. As much as every fiber of his being screamed for him to fight, to grab his son and drag him out of this madness, instinct gained the upper hand. He turned and ran, fighting through the chaos of snapping jaws, swinging blades, and gunfire. He didn't stop running until he was well away from the camp, the night swallowing him whole. Hours later, he crouched in the ruins of an abandoned strip mall, shaking with equal parts rage and despair. His son was alive, but Carl was gone. The boy he had once held in his arms, the boy who had laughed when Rick helped him saddle his first pony at Herschel's farm. That boy was nothing but a memory now. And Rick realized, with bitter clarity, that the world had done this. Or maybe he had. Maybe falling into a coma, leaving Carl and Lori alone to face this nightmare, had signed their fates long before he ever woke. But fury offered no answers, and tears brought no solutions. Rick needed a plan. He needed to find a way to get Carl out of the Reaper's clutches before there was nothing left of him to save. But how? What could one broken man do against an army of killers who thrived in this unrelenting hell? Rick's mind raced for hours, thoughts twisting on themselves like storming crows. He knew the Reapers wouldn't just vanish, wouldn't simply let him swoop in and take what they saw as theirs. His only advantage was that they hadn't killed him on sight. They didn't see him as a threat. Maybe he could use that. The next morning, Rick returned to the outskirts of the factory compound, risking everything to blend into the shadows. The Reapers were already on high alert, securing the area after the walker attack had thinned their ranks. Rick watched them from a distance, his eyes fixing on Carl whenever possible. Despite the brutality around him, Carl moved like he belonged, his interactions with the others seamless. It was the kind of belonging Rick desperately wanted for his son in another life, but never like this. Never here. Over the next few days, Rick silently tailed the Reapers' movements, observing the cracks in their unit. Power struggles simmered between certain members, tension palpable during quarrels over resources and leadership. Rick saw opportunities there. He would exploit those fractures, sow discord from the outside. When night fell on the 5th day, Rick struck. He scavenged walkers from nearby woods as if herding cattle, using firecrackers he'd saved from an old gas station to draw them toward the Reaper's camp. From a hidden vantage, Rick lit the fuse and watched as the fireworks ripped apart the quiet night, echoed by the guttural howls of the dead. The herd descended like a wave of rot and hunger, leaving the Reapers scrambling once more. In the chaos, Rick breached the perimeter as silently as a shadow, moving with the methodical precision of a man on borrowed time. He found Carl near the center of it all, shouting orders to panicking members like a commander in training. For a split second, Rick just stared, unable to reconcile the boy in front of him with the toddler who used to ride on his shoulders. Then he forced himself forward, knocking out a distracted guard with the butt of his stolen rifle. Carl spun on him, his face alive with rage, but Rick grabbed his arm before he could aim. "I'm not leaving without you," Rick rasped, his words raw with determination. "I don't care what the world's done to you, Carl. You're my son." Carl hesitated, his arm twitching in Rick's grip. But then the Reapers closed in, tearing the choice away from both of them. Shots rang out, and this time, Rick fought like there was no tomorrow, his desperation lending him the strength of a dozen men. He didn't know if it was enough. In the storm of violence and blood, he only had one truth to cling to. No matter what it cost, he would not let go of Carl again.